And I'll be talking more or less of the history of the idea of place, but I decided I would change the title a little bit to make it a little Guntherish and also to get in a little bit of the 19th century philosophy. You may have heard of it being called A Strange Land and a Peculiar People. So putting those two together, of course, the title is Inside Appalachia, Familiar Land and Ordinary People. But before I start, I think it is wise, before calling any Appalachian phenomenon, no matter what it is, unique, one should be able, one must be able to answer no to each of the following two questions. Is it southern and is it rural? More about that later, but just keep that in the back of your mind. In the beginning, there was nothing called Appalachia. Rather, there was something called backcountry, which reflected the Atlantic hinge mentality of the late colonial period economics. That's to say, it was cheaper to bring things from England, let us say, all the way across the Atlantic than to move it inland roughly 50 miles. Individual cities had rivers that provide them access to hinterlands. The Appalachia, a pioneer period, that is a period probably best shown in Otis K. Russ's book called The Allegheny Frontier, had it all over flatland America. The hunting and the fishing and the water quality was better in the mountains. Not only that, the mountains had a ready supply of timber for housing, for heating, and home furnishings. And the idea of constructing a pig pen with 4 sides seemed wasteful when one could pen in the head of a hollow and allow the razorbacks to run wild until time to kill them, and call it quits at that. In Appalachia was something that I like to call subsistence prosperity. That is to say that there was enough around to do all right on your own. Hard cash was somewhat superfluous, though from saltpeter caves, ginseng diggings, and some off and on logging, there were opportunities for cash as well. The transportation revolution, which featured the Erie Canal and the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad and unleashed a bunch of turnpikes as well as canal and railroad companies, was that quantifiable quantum jump in the antebellum push for progress. It was a jump that passed almost all of Appalachia by, and for good reason. The cost, for example, of building a canal up mountains is prohibitive. There wasn't the economic base there as well. Quantifiable progress of the making 2 blades of grass grow where there was but one before would later become the rage. There had been a day when if you want to be president, you'd better been born in a log cabin, or at least been an effective liar on that part, as the log cabin candidate who became president was. There had been a day when most Americans were subsistent farmers, when rural schools everywhere looked pretty much like those of Appalachia, although found with a greater density elsewhere. On the other hand, from the days of George Bancroft forward, the idea of progress was a heady theme in American thought. Whether it be the rise from the evils of colonial conditions to the heights of a rising nation, or the Darwinistic survival of the fittest, a natural selection turned tribal mentality, which seemed to prove America's optimistic and conceited views of itself, be it manifest destiny, Indian removals, or whatever. Progress was getting away from frontier conditions. It was picket fences and bandstands, and the exploitation of resources. It was the quest for the almighty dollar, clear-cutting of America's natural and human resources for maximum short-term gain. But following the Civil War, two groups of flatlanders, Protestant missionaries who were battered by the wave after wave after wave of the new immigration in the increasingly Catholic, Jewish, and Greek Orthodox cities, and local color writers found a market for their superficial travel sketches gutted up in double-distilled Elizabethans. These groups gave Appalachia a high profile. By turning the atypical into the typical, they stereotyped the region. Here was not Rip Van Winkle land, but Brigadoon. The do-gooders had about as much understanding of Appalachia as the goo-goos did of urban political rings. One of my favorite quotes from this period dates from 1899, and it's from J. Stoddard Johnston's The Romance and Tragedy of Kentucky, and it includes what I consider a whopper. This is the home of the whopper, the real one. Help has come to these marooned people. They didn't know they were marooned. I don't know whether that was their skin color or what, the maroon there. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad and the Louisville and Nashville and the Kentucky Eastern have worked wonders among their routes, as is evidenced by their thrifty towns. I mean, that's a Scottish stereotype, isn't it? Thrifty. With churches, institutions of higher education, mills, furnaces, and mines, which may now be seen where formerly all was stagnant. Such nonsense were but non-events in the eyes of most of Appalachia's population. More important for the inhabitants themselves was the rapid population growth in the area, one not diminished to the extent that it was in the rest of the country by the westward movement. Indeed, in Appalachia, the preferable option was to move up towards the head of the hollow, an option unavailable to prairie dwellers. The increase in density of, quote, cousins, unquote, strengthened the sense of place in Appalachia. In time, old home place assumed a special aura, being the locale of reunions and the geographical focal point of a sense of family solidarity. Who are you? And the name of the branch upon which you lived was sufficient to give one a sense of person with respect to those one had never even met before. Physically, the increased population density created bad agricultural habits, and the I fell out of my cornfield hillside farms came into being. What actually was lost was, of course, topsoil. For eastern Kentucky, at least, the stereotype of a large family was a reality, and that added to the pressure on the land. I would guess that the usual Appalachian strange land and a peculiar people versus the idea of progress, which is the latter being the norm of mainline America, might be viewed from a different perspective, namely as a harbinger of the dichotomy that exploded on the American scene in the 1920s and helped make that decade one of the most interesting in all of American history, and that is, of course, the dichotomy of traditional values versus the forces of modernism. The irony of this juxtaposition has not been lost on me, for it was about the year 1920 that pluralism and regionalism was accepted, and Appalachia no longer was an ideological threat. Modernism became the new non-ethnic peril. In that context, the Appalachian experience was not at all that different from that of rural America or the South. Indeed, Thomas D. Clark's portrayal at lunch yesterday of the Southern country store and sadness over the loss of that institution, as well as the fourth class post offices, country schools, and the drummer, can be seen in the traditional value context, and as well can be seen as a rural, as a Southern phenomenon, one not limited to Appalachia. Ron Eller's emphasis on community and relationship and his differentiation between land as place and land as commodity, his differentiation between linear time and cyclical time, may also prove useful. William H. Turner's lynch, with boom or bust in the coal industry being a most significant fact of life, far exceeding the importance of place, leads to another question, and that is, what is typically Appalachian? Some years I start my Appalachian history course by asking the students, most of whom live in the region, to name a typical Appalachian county. And the first debate, and that's where the fun begins, whether or not it is a coal county or a non-coal county. And I suspect if I were teaching in North Carolina, the query would not be that, but whether or not such a county have a significant tourist trade. Robert Ryman's presentation, A Better Understanding of the Sense of Place in Central Appalachia, found a number of identifiable regions in this 85-county region using variables such as religion and occupation. Recently, James Still wrote, Appalachia is that somewhat mythical region with no now known boundaries. If such an area exists in terms of geography, such a domain has shaped the lives and endeavors of men and women from pioneer days to the present and given them an independence and an outlook and a vision such as is often attributed to them, I trust to be understood for imagining the heart of it to be in the hills of eastern Kentucky. That is to say, that place is particular and specific, not general. Appalachia is not so much a place as it is made up of many places. The opposite of place, I think, may be the term army brat, that often bright offspring of army life, whose knowledge of world geography is often firsthand. Roots are personal, tied to a locale, and often develop during one's own formative years. They are not limited to southern, rural, or Appalachian areas. The sense of place is not necessarily a positive experience, as William H. Turner indicated. The blacks of Lynch left for a variety of reasons, not all of them economic. For more than a decade, I have taken an unofficial survey by hand of my Appalachian history students. And up until very recently, the number of those who can't wait to go back to their home county, and the number who can't wait to get out of there for good, was very close every single time to 50-50. However, recently, the would-be out-migrants are in a substantial majority. That may just be on the timeline there. Who knows? John Stevenson's view that pan-Appalachianism is a rarity, certainly true in Kentucky, where eastern Kentucky usually in fact means either northeastern or southeastern Kentucky, but rarely the entire 32, or if using the number of counties that can apply for funds at the federal government, 49 counties. George Wolford's Ashland-centric eastern Kentucky and David Hopp's Pikeville hazard access-oriented eastern Kentucky, I suggest, probably do not overlap substantially. The sense of feeling Appalachian being related to living in a flatlander environment may help explain the huge turnouts of former Lynch blacks at annual national meetings, while at the same time not feeling particularly attached to the place. May also explain why my Eastern Kentucky pictorial history sold over 200 copies in Prestonsburg, Kentucky, Floyd County, the home of wheelwright and other coal camps. For these camps are but shells of their former selves, their former glory. It reminds me of a year spent in Winter Park, Florida, during 1952-1953. I have never gone back, ever. But my mother did visit it once and told me you wouldn't want to visit it. It has changed so. But the coming of Goofy and Mickey Mouse to Central Florida has totally changed the ambiance of much of that region. My Eastern Kentucky pictorial history was written more for the people of the region than for an academic audience, and was advertised through accounts of it coming out in the weeklies of the area. Now, what surprised me was the response of those who had left the region. I mean, not just a how much query, but sharing. And I will share you a couple of examples of this. I'm from Hazard, Kentucky. I live here in Anderson, Indiana. I have my dad here with me, who is 82 years old, who worked 47 years in Blue Diamond coal mines. I mean, not hardly the type of information that you need to order a book, but nevertheless, the need to share that information. Or how about this one? I was born in Corbin, Kentucky. My father was in the Civil War. He was born in Whitley County, February 13th, 1843, died August 19th, 1919. The first wife he married, my mother, Polly Johnson. He had 4 children by Polly. She was 20 years old, and he was 60 when they married. But again, you have that sense of place and the importance of it there. These are hardly formed letters. Paintsville's Ed Hazlett lamented some years back the tendency for family manuscripts to be passed on to relatives who have moved away when they turn home over Memorial Day weekends. Both C. Nelson Grody, who mentioned being welcomed home after an absence of more than a decade from this campus, and Sarah Ebenek's talk of pathwalkers suggest the strength of a mountain identity is perhaps strongest when viewed from afar. Some years ago, I was told that if at a historical convention you want to cause about as much havoc as yelling fire in a crowded theater, ask the seemingly innocent question after the papers are given and it's time for questions, well, what about the South? Thomas Govan, a historian of the South, had a final lecture in his Old South course in which his theme was that there was no South. I suspect that we could do just about the same thing with at least equal impact respecting that place, Appalachia. In summary, place is very much a part of Appalachia, but despite the efforts of 19th century flatlanders to homogenize the region into a stereotypical whole, localism, with the county being the largest unit, rather than a thing called Appalachia, appears to be the most significant level of place for Appalachia. Thank you.
Anyway, I did some research into highway markers and found out some interesting things. You have any idea how many highway markers are in the state of Kentucky? And last report I have is 1985. 1,772 throughout the state of Kentucky. Most of them are not located in eastern Kentucky. As you might guess, most of them are located and found in the bluegrass and in western Kentucky. And by far the largest numbers are in 3 counties: Jefferson, Fayette, and McCracken, for some ungodly reason. I don't know why. In fact, if you look through the list of highway markers, the first 15 listed there are all in Fayette County. And you must get down to number 31 before you find the first one that appears in eastern Kentucky. A sample of county numbers to show you how few are in this region: Menifee, 3, Carter, 14, Pike, 7, Rowan, 4, Wolf, 7, Knott, 9, Coffin, 6, Floyd, 8, Lewis, 8. And you wonder, why is this true? Why are there so few in the eastern Kentucky region? Probably because eastern Kentucky has not played as significant a role in the development of the Commonwealth as are the regions. I think we would all know that the center of power and influence and has long been the bluegrass, and we are on the fringe. What does surprise me is how western Kentucky is able to get so many. And it may just simply be because they have very aggressive local historical societies that go after them. In fact, I'm on the review board for eastern Kentucky. They come across my desk, and I'm supposed to say, let's have one there or not have one. I like to read highway markers. One criticism I have of Kentucky markers is the fact they are frequently inaccessible. Out in the west, for example, in Nevada, they tell you 500 feet before you get there, there's a highway marker coming up. You've got plenty of time to prepare for it. You've got a place to pull off the road and read it. But here, that's almost impossible. They don't tell you they're going to come up, and when they do, they're just on the side of the road. If you stop and try to see one, you'll have a multi-car pileup behind you. So you have to park down the road, run back, and read it. Consequently, they don't get very much exposure. In looking through the entire listing of Eastern Kentucky historical markers, I can make some general observations. First, nearly all of them deal with the time period from the exploration to the Civil War. Second, they reveal the basis of Eastern Kentucky's economy. Third, they show the outside influence in this area. And fourth, they show that very few famous people came from Eastern Kentucky. I don't want to get criticized for that one, but that's what they show. I will divide the markers into 5 categories and tell you what they reveal. The categories are first exploration and settlement, the economy, then the Civil War, then people, and finally education. It is amazing how nearly all of the markers can be placed under these headings. First, exploration and settlement. A large number of the highway markers in this area deal with the early white exploration. I was surprised that there are not more markers relating our extensive Indian influence. The only pure Indian marker is found in Greenup County that marks the site of an Indian village and mound. While other markers mention Indian presence, they are always followed by mention of the pioneers who followed the Indians into the region. The markers tell us the exact nature of white penetration into eastern Kentucky. We find in Laurel and Bell counties the notation that here was the Wilderness Road. In Jackson County, the road is called the Warrior's Path and connected the Shawnee in Ohio with the Cherokee in Tennessee. But of course, the marker was quick to add that both Boone and Findlay passed over this Warrior's Path as well. The other end of the Warrior's Path is found up in Mason County. I guess Mason County is in Kentucky. I'm going to include it in here for purposes of this talk. In Mason County, we find the name of the Warrior's Path given, and it is described as being first a buffalo trace, which was then followed by the Indians, then followed by explorers. The mention of Mason County reminds us that it was the second doorway into Kentucky, the first doorway being through the southeastern mountains, the second doorway through this river town. There are 21 markers in Mason County, and that's a large number, and most of them deal with the early settlement of that community. In fact, I can almost always count on another Mason County request coming across desk, which I generally throw back immediately. Mason County doesn't need another one. If a tree falls now in Mason County, they want to put a historical marker to it over there. For example, we are told in Mason County that it was first settled by Simon Kenton in 1775. We are told that it was at one end of the famous Maysville Turnpike, and we are told that it was an important trading manufacturing center. I think these are all true. It is amazing how many of the markers deal with Indian massacres. Certainly they are negative against the Indians and give the impression that it was very dangerous to live in the region in the late 18th century. We are told that the first settlement in eastern Kentucky was at Harmon Station in Johnson County in 1787. This, of course, doesn't take into account Maysville. It was an important settlement because it held out against the Indians, it broke their power, and therefore it says opened the big sandy valley to settlement of whites. Over in Menifee County, there is a romantic place called Murder Branch, which I found marks a great massacre, and they always use that word, Indian massacre, which occurred there in 1793. And Kentucky was a dark and bloody ground if you look at these early highway markers. The second category is the Civil War. By far, the majority of markers in eastern Kentucky deal with the Civil War. And it seems that most of those deal with two men, James Garfield and Morgan. Mentioned to this was a general called George Morgan, not to be confused with the flashing John Hunt Morgan of the Confederate Army. This poor Union general, George Morgan, got himself and 9,000 soldiers caught down in Bell County. Outmaneuvered and outnumbered, he began what the markers called a masterful retreat of 200 miles to the Ohio River. In 16 days, he worked his way north and crossed the Ohio in Greenup County to the safety of Yankee country. Every county has a marker, the historic masterful retreat. We are not told what happened to General Morgan, but I suspect he probably fell out of bed one night and broke his neck. Not a very lucky man. More noteworthy are the many exploits of John Hunt Morgan, a Confederate general. We can find the route through eastern Kentucky of his last raid. He entered the state in Lewis County on June the 1st, 1864. He burned the courthouse at Mount Sterling, and he left through Pike County into Virginia. We are not told that this is a masterful retreat, and I suspect it probably was. And I am convinced that the architecture of all eastern Kentucky courthouses dates from the Reconstruction period. Some 25 courthouses were burned, and it seems that everyone has to have a marker in its yard saying, "Courthouse burned." Courthouse burned. Of course, with the burnings went all of those wonderful records that had the history of the counties. This kind of activity, this constant burning and attacking courthouses, led to frayed nerves. Let me read a couple of markers to you. I don't read just two of these. This one is over in Martin County. And wording kind of surprises me because it's Union in sentiment. It says, "A plundering, burning Confederate detached force under command of Colonel V.A. Wicker harassed East Kentucky and West Virginia during most of the Civil War. In the fall of 1864, they took horses and cattle in this area from friend and foe, while Wicker's men made barbecue. Home guards from Louisa attacked from hill to west. After exchange of fire, both withdrew." Here's another one. This one is kind of sad. This is down in Pike County. "Here was the body of a soldier of the Confederacy, struck down by an unknown assassin in May of 1865, apparently on way to home in the South. He was buried in a coffin made of boards, riveted from a giant oak by poor Miss Community. After the turn of the century, a rose bush marked this final resting place of a soldier who is known to God." Anyone from the region knows the name of James A. Garfield. We find it all over Floyd County. And he stayed in a house there known as the Garfield House, now torn down in the site of a bank. This is a problem with many of these markers. The sites are no longer there. There in Floyd County, Garfield fought the Battle of Ivy Mountain, the first important engagement of the Civil War in the Big Sandy River Valley. This is certainly not to compare to Gettysburg, but I guess in the Big Sandy Valley it was important. In Pike County, we find where Garfield was commissioned general. Two interesting markers are found in Lewis County. There in Lewis County is the only Union memorial in the South. And in Breathitt County, we find a marker related to World War I. Some of you may know that Breathitt County was, I think, the only county that fulfilled its quota of World War I soldiers solely on the basis of voluntary service. It was not necessary in Breathitt County to draft. The marker also said that Kentuckians who were drafted in World War I were also above average on their physical exams. No mention is made of the mental exams that the Kentuckians took, but physically they were above average. The economy of eastern Kentucky is told in the highway markers. To look at the markers tells us just about everything we need to know about the early economy of this region. We know that Lewis County became a port of entry for cattle and horses brought from Fort Pitt and then brought deep into the county, into the state. The river counties were a way to also export goods out of the region, and the Big Sandy played the same kind of role farther to the east. In Carter County, we find an early industry was the mining of saltpeter, which was very important for the manufacturing of gunpowder during the War of 1812. Much larger industry, as you may know, was iron production. In fact, in this whole area, from Bath County all the way east to Boyd County, you find numerous markers saying that on this site was an iron furnace that produced so much pig iron in the early 19th century. Present in this area were the natural resource of limestone, iron ore, and charcoal. As long as these lasted, much iron was produced. The markers tell us that Kentucky was third in the nation in iron production in the 1830s. In Greenup County, iron was produced as early as 1791 at Raccoon Furnace. And in Carter County, the Mount Savage iron furnace produced 15 tons of pig iron a day for 37 years. Much of this iron was shipped up to the Ohio River and then to places elsewhere in the nation. Surprisingly, I find nothing in the way markers about the timber industry in eastern Kentucky. There is mention in Greenup County that the Eastern Kentucky Railroad ran from the Ohio 38 miles south to Lawrence County and that it took coal and timber out of the region. In the 1880s, that railroad was part of a Lake Erie to Virginia commercial route. But that's the only information I have on the great and extensive timber industry. In the same vein, we find in Bell County the name of Alexander Arthur, who in 1885 came from England to take iron out of that tremendously rich area down there. And the English investors poured literally millions of dollars into Bell County. In fact, they made a model city, Middlesboro, and it was all to no avail. Although there was coal and there was iron ore, they found that their investment simply didn't make a profit. But they left us a very unusual city. I don't know if you've been to Middlesboro, but it is a remarkable city, I think, to find it deep in the Appalachian region. Much later, in Greenlee, we note that the first continuous steel rolling mill was built there in 1923. Another early industry was the mining of salt. In Perry County, in 1835, salt wells were drilled by hand. Salt was sold locally or over the mountains in Virginia for $1 a bushel. The wells unfortunately flooded in 1892, and that was the end of the salt industry. Eastern Kentucky was also a mecca for early tourists. Maybe more tourists came to Eastern Kentucky then than they come now. The markers tell us that people came to Eastern Kentucky to take the waters. Some young people may not know what taking the waters is. It's a great tradition that I'm afraid is long gone. In Bath County is the great Olympian, opened in 1791 and visited by none other than Henry Clay himself. Many Laconians fled there during the cholera epidemic of 1833. In Wolfe County is the Swango Springs Spa, no longer there, of course, but it was found to have healing properties when owner treated her pet dog for mange. They got well, and it sunk in. If my dog got well of mange, maybe it will help people. By 1895, there were 3 hotels and boarding houses present there in Wolfe County, all for dogs. No. 3 hotels and boarding houses for people, and the water was bottled and shipped around the country until 1943. In Lewis County was the Esopia Spring, I guess that's how that's pronounced, which was a health resort from 1845 to 1860. Located in Lewis County, it was adjacent to the river. People came down on riverboats, got off, went to this spring, and took the waters. It died, I think, in the conflict leading to the Civil War. In Lewis County also is a marker, a unique marker. I don't know why Lewis County keeps having unique markers. Anyone from Lewis County in here? Good. There is a marker over there to an oak tree, to a 150-year-old oak tree, and they were going to build a highway through this area, and they diverted that way around it, and they went around this oak tree. They decided to put a marker up to it. This behemoth is 16.2 feet in diameter, 58 feet tall. As the marker says, it is one of nature's beautiful achievements. Maybe that's a thing to have. Another beautiful achievement is seen in the large number of covered bridges built to protect one from the inclement weather. Each was a little different, depending upon the ability and taste of local craftsmen. As you may know, the Goddard White Bridge over in Fleming County is one of the last remaining covered bridges in eastern Kentucky. There were at one time more than 400 covered bridges in the region, in the whole state of Kentucky. Finally, Lewis County once again had apparently a great amount of tan bark, which was very important in the process of tanning. And so several tanneries grew up in that county. And indeed, we're told in one of the markers that Ulysses Grant's father invested heavily in these tanneries and often visited Lewis County. What about the people in eastern Kentucky? Who is famous from this region that is noted by historical marker? In Lawrence County, Fred Benson, Secretary of the Treasury, and, of course, Chief Justice of the United States. In Carter County, William Fields, who became governor 1923-1927, found out that he got in one scandal after another. Guy was as crooked as a serpentine wall. He retired from the governorship in 1927, went back to Carter County, and gained the name of Honest Bill from Olive Hill. What a crazy name. Down in Johnson County, they're proud of Jenny Wiley, carried off by the Indians. That's a wonderful story. There must be 1,000 of those stories. Always a white maiden carried off by the Indians. They treat her wonderfully, but she wants to get away. After a year, Jenny Wiley escaped and came back into Kentucky. Most of those stories are crazy. In Letcher and Harlan County, we find markers noting the influence that it gave to the writer John Knox Jr. Although he was from Paris, Kentucky, he got his inspiration for his wonderful novels, The Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come, and the, what is it, The Road of, the what? Trail of Lonesome Pine, yeah. He was inspired by the mountains in those regions. In Fleming County, we find the last home of John Findlay, who was an early pioneer and settler of Kentucky. He came there in 1896 to farm 1,000 acres of land, not a bad spread. Johnson County is the home of Richard Johnson, Vice President of the United States, 1837-1841. He said that he killed Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames in the War of 1812 and ran on the platform, Rumsey-Dumpsey, Rumsey-Dumpsey, General Johnson killed Tecumseh. And he was elected viceman with Martin Van Buren. Letcher County, I didn't know this one, was the home of Francis Gary Powers. And I bet people don't remember who Francis Gary Powers is anymore. Who was he? Yeah, right. You know what what were 2 incidents?
He was flying the two spy planes over Russia and was shot down.
Right. Sure did. Yeah, 1960. Yeah, Eisenhower admitted that he was spying. He was on CIA spy mission over Russia. Good. I love the way the wording on this, though. The wording of it is just what you said. Bailed out 1,300 miles over Russia. Think about that. He bailed out 1,300 miles over Russia. Some feat. You know, just like that. You got to be careful how you word these markers. He died apparently in 1977 in a helicopter crash after being in prison for 2 years. And finally, Mason County, again, is the home of Albert Sidney Johnston. Education, the last point I want to mention. I was very surprised by the large number of settlement schools in Knott County. I was aware of the work of Alice Lloyd, who came to Knott County from Boston in 1916. I knew of the Hindman Settlement School that opened in 1902 by May Stone and Catherine Pettit. And by the way, that tells you about these very interesting women who were dedicated to an ideal of educating and uplifting the poor of Appalachia and came out of rather sophisticated urban backgrounds to work here. But I was not aware of George Clark's subscription school down in Knott County. When Clark died, his epitaph read, "Let God be praised and let Eastern Kentucky rejoice that so great a man once graced its soil." They only write that about us. In Rowan County, on this campus, we find a marker to Cora W. Stuart, who in 1911 started the Moonlight School. And I think that marker, isn't it, just right over here in front of that little school? You know, she brought people into her school at night because they worked all day. She taught the illiterate to read and to write. Her example was imitated nationally and even internationally. And certainly she deserves a marker. And maybe home is a good place to end. What can I conclude? I can conclude this. If you look at the historical markers, not much has happened in Eastern Kentucky after 1865. But I don't want to say just Eastern Kentucky. Not much has happened in Kentucky after 1865. It's almost impossible to find histories of recent Kentucky. Seems like everything ended with the death of Henry Clay and the end of the Civil War. And you got to look long and hard to find a marker after that. Well, those are the comments I want to make. Does anybody want to say anything about historical markers or any point to have on them? I once wrote a review of a book, and I said, as Stuart knows, I said in the book, this book is terrible. It reads like a historical marker. I never was asked to review for that journal again. I'm furious. I think you want questions or comments? This, by the way, if you're interested in historical markers, because I must tell you, all I did was sit down with this. This is published by the Kentucky Historical Society. It's entitled A Guide to Kentucky Historical Highway Markers. It lists every one of them and tells you what they read. And so, really interesting. Just try to go see all of them.
I didn't realize this was going to be quite a media event, as it is here. I don't come to you from a frontier, except perhaps way. I come to you now from darkest Newark, New Jersey. And I've been there for all 5 weeks. I'm still safe. I came before that from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When I moved to Pittsburgh from Illinois, I said, Pittsburgh, who wants to live in Pittsburgh? Now I'm in New Jersey, and of course I said to myself, New Jersey, who wants to move to New Jersey? Well, finally I'm liking both places. And look forward to this visit to talk on Appalachia. I've done it before, visiting the campus at Boone, North Carolina, and had a grand time there, and I do want to share some thoughts with you today. Your president said earlier that he had come home, and my talk is really a spin-off of the earlier title you were just given. I'm titling it now, Is There Any Place Like Home? There's a young American writer. Her name is Annie Dillard. Maybe some of you have read her. Some people like her, some people don't. And this fall, she published her childhood memories of growing up in Pittsburgh. So immediately I went out and bought the hardbound copy of the book instead of waiting for the paperback like I usually do. Already Annie Dillard had won a Pulitzer Prize in 1975 for a very powerful book called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And she described life, not in Pittsburgh there, but in backcountry Virginia. And in a review of her new book, In American Childhood, in September, this September, just a couple weeks ago, a writer on rural life by the name of Noel Perrin said, Annie Dillard is one of those people who seems to be more fully alive than most of us, more nearly wide awake than human beings generally get to be. And then Noel Perrin compared her to the English poet William Blake. And Blake was once asked to describe his reaction to a plain, ordinary sunrise. Blake said, what, and he questioned, when the sun rises, do you not see a round disk of fire, something like a guinea? A guinea is an English coin, I think a gold coin. And Blake answered, no, I see with the sunrise an innumerable company of the heavenly host crying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. Another vision. And Perrin, in his view of Annie Dillard's book, said, Dillard is similarly a stunning observer, in his words. And readers of Dillard's book on Appalachia's Tinker Creek will remember, for example, her account of a sunlit tree which seemed to explode before her, with the sunshine pouring in on it. Or was the explosion really in her mind? This putting together the juxtaposition of hyper-aware people and powerful landscapes is still an American tradition which deserves more examination. And it goes back to Puritan hotheads like William Bradford and Francis Higginson and Edward Johnson. And it goes through Crevecoeur and Bartram in the early days of this country, and particularly Thoreau and Whitman. We've already had Thoreau mentioned once this morning. Before we get to people like John Muir, anybody who's read John Muir can hardly forget his description climbing to the top of a pine tree in a forest in the Sierras in the middle of a lightning storm and swaying back and forth up there as the lightning crashed around him. He was a hothead. And then there are 20th century writers like Mary Austin and Edward Abbey and a lot of Appalachian writers who are very well covered in this conference. Yet we Americans struggle with a sense of place, in part because of our placelessness. We're all immigrants constantly on the move, or at least I feel like one, coming from around Chicago, then going to college in Indiana and New York City, ending up in Pittsburgh, and finally in New Jersey. But few of us really live in the house in which we were born. Very, very few of us. We're constantly on the move. We are immigrants. Once I read a paper in North Carolina on the history of quality of life in America, explaining its rural origins. And I argued that Americans did possess a strong, even a kind of religious, spiritual, metaphysical sense of place. A historian named John Hope Franklin was there, and he vigorously disagreed. He said Americans had never had any attachment to land, much less a physical place in a personal or spiritual way. That we Americans by nature are drifters. We're always on the move. But I believe the most powerful description in a book made by an American of personal survival by belonging to a place of cloddish land is geographically located on the southern edge of Appalachia. This book describes the lives, the work, and the home places of 3 dirt-poor tenant or sharecropper farmers in northeastern Alabama. They find themselves under the scrutiny of a New York writer, joined by a professional photographer, on assignment from Fortune magazine. Not very auspicious a start. Sounds very condescending. City slickers looking down their noses at poor folks. But something extraordinary happened. The magazine assignment was forgotten and eventually dropped. The writer and the photographer stayed for weeks, and the result of their visit was a mutual respect between the visitors and the 3 farm families, partly wary and partly generous. And it opened up the way for a process of discovery of a set of powerful realities embedded in ordinary people's lives. And also, it inevitably opened up the process of self-discovery by these visitors themselves. Their names were James Agee and Walker Evans. And the book, of course, is titled, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And the title is taken from the book of Ecclesiasticus in the Apocrypha. James Agee went on to write the powerful novel, A Death in the Family. And he was a movie screenplay writer. He wrote the screenplay for the movie The Quiet One, and also for The African Queen, before he died of a heart attack at the age of 45. Walker Evans became one of America's premier photojournalists. And I wish that we could look at some of the pictures he put together in the book, looking at these 3 families. They visited 3 families, the Ricketts, the Woods, Gudger families, in the summer of 1936. Not one of the best years in American history, right in the midst of the Depression. After they completed their book, Agee and Evans had a great deal of difficulty finding a publisher. Finally, in Boston, of all places, Houghton Mifflin brought out the book in 1940. It sold only 600 copies and disappeared. But in 1960, it re-entered American literature as a classic and is still in print today. I discovered it in an honors seminar with an undergraduate student, little pitch for honors programs here. And I discovered it in the spring of 1986. Well, the student went on and got an NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, Younger Scholars Award last summer. He got $2,000. I get to present this paper. Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, the book, is multidimensional, a rich and fertile and ever-surprising source describing work on a dirt farm, southern Appalachian poverty at its worst, the waste of human beings, especially children. It also explores personal family intimacy, almost too closely, as we'll see, as well as human despair and the capacity to endure. But here I want to consider its claims concerning space, place, landscape, and home, and they take up at least 1/3 of the book. These farms of the Ricketts, the Woods, and the Gudgers are hardly even farms in the usual productive sense. They are barely indifferent locations, nothing places, where daily survival is a kind of raw, immediate agenda. Even townspeople a few miles away laugh and sneer at these people. George Gudger is seen as a nice man, but not with a sense of wit, is the way he's described. His wife, Annie Mae, is described as a woman who was one of the worst whores around before she married him. They really look down on these people, and they're just a few miles away, and we can begin to see a separateness beginning to emerge in this, as these people experience this isolation. The place presses on them and fills their lives. Lives not much different in 1936 from perhaps today's survivors in Ethiopia or Bangladesh. A.G. describes the fields as workrooms, poorer than New York garment district swaps. The farms are like frontier outposts in a still existing wilderness which is swarming, tangled, and frightening. George and Annie Mae Gudger and their family, for example, get all their water for cooking, washing, and drinking from a spring 150 yards downhill in a damp jungle-like ravine, and A.G. describes it. The hill path runs narrowly, slick as a scalp, among thick weeds, and toward trees whose green-brown bloom and coolness is sudden. Within the roof of leaves, low on upward right, the spring, the dirt all round dark and strong-rooted and fragrant, tamped smooth as soap with bare feet. A mottled piece of plant kneel. The water stands, in a look not of motion, yet of quiet compulsion, into a basin a foot deep, floored with dead oak leaves, and shored up with slimy wood. There's an untended garden plot at the right rear of the house, which is reverting backwards to wilderness. And we learned that the struggle of the Gudgers, which is the family we're going to concentrate on here, the struggle is not to go forward, but to avoid slipping back. And A.G. describes, in part, this garden plot. The frowsy weeds stand halfway up these walls. Inside, the planting is concentrated to the utmost possible in green and pink-veined wax and velvet butter beans, and in rank tomatoes hung low, burst against the ground, in hairy buds of okra. All these spring heavy with weeds and smothered in texture shades of their leaves, blown like nearly exploded balloons in the full spread of the summer, each in its shape and nature, so that the whole of this space is one blousy, bristling pool and splendor of worm and insect-embroidered plants, waist deep to wade in, so twined and spired and reaching among each other that the paths between rows are discernible only like steps confounded in snow, as if you're walking in a deep snowfield in this kind of tangle. In this wildness, the clearing for the Gudger home is, in A.G.'s words, however, dumped by chance in eternal space, open and defenseless. The wilderness is around them, the land right around their place is entirely bare, and then these houses crop up there, as he says, defenseless, naked, almost as if they were involved in some kind of eternal dimension. George Gudger's house and barn, if a log shed can be called a barn, and the outbuildings are in sharpest contrast to the wildness around them. They appear completely, metaphysically bare, down to a basic blonde dirt with rag edges of grass. The buildings are unsquare. They're all made of unpainted pine planks. And in A.G.'s words, in some the grain has almost disappeared. The wood has a texture and look like that of weathered bone. Unquote. A.G. is surprised that such a plain, desperate, isolated place could have such an impact on him. It exists, as he put it, between hurt but invincible nature and the plainest cruelties and needs of human existence in this uncured time, this undomesticated, this uncivilized, this unsettled, and therefore kind of raw and open time. The Gudger attempt to create a home becomes a barely temporary human intrusion upon a 100-million-year-old wilderness. The family's off in the fields. A.G. is left alone in the house. He feels like a voyeur. He calls himself a cold laboring spy, a peeping Tom who got inside the house. I shall move, they would trust me not to, as I could not were they here. And he does. He invades every room, opening drawers, testing beds, inspecting personal belongings or on dressers and shelves, even smelling around as if he was some critter from outer space. As he puts it, examining every secrecy from fungoid under-earth to rare hot root. And he inserts himself knowingly into their private world, almost like an invading rapist, probing inside the meaning of home. But fortunately, he's also embarrassed and guilty as he prowls around their house while they're away in the fields. And he feels duty-bound to validate the importance of the inner lives of the Gudgers. With an intensity of Annie Dillard or William Blake, he observes the quietly triumphant vigilance of the extended senses, his senses tuning in to every nook and cranny of this house. An intricate task of surgery, he says, a deep stealthfulness, not for the shame of the people, not to embarrass the people, but in fear and in honor of the house itself. They have gone, and it is now my chance to perceive this, their home, as it is, in whose hollow heart resounds the loud, zinc-flickering heartbeat of the cheap alarm. A human shelter, a strangely lined nest, a creature of killed pine, stitched together with nails about as rude a garment against the hostilities of heaven as a human family may wear, silent and undefended in the sun. At another point, A.G. even inspects the Gudger's clothes, greasy pants, a flour sack shift, cracked and muddied dress shoes. But now I just don't care any longer. I don't care how anything looks. Although she had no money for lace, homemaking demanded that she strive for prettiness. In this case, it was almost childlike, as if Mrs. Gudger knew only what a 9-year-old knew about domestic prettiness. And the attempt was soon abandoned, but reluctantly and with sorrow. With this impossibility of keeping up with all the Joneses in the world, or any Joneses, the Gudgers' sense of home fell apart. What could they fall back on? That's really one of my major questions in this essay. They had 4 rooms, each 12 feet square, in their house. The wide floor planks were bare and polished by naked feet. Each piece of furniture, A.G. observed, stood like an independent object, nothing touching anything else. As he puts it, chairs, beds, bureaus, trunks, vases, trinkets, general odds and ends are set very plainly and squarely discrete from one another and from walls. The objects in the rooms float in the room, not tied down or associated with anything else. And this signaled the disorientation, the uncertainty of the Gudgers. They were not measuring up to any known public standard as homemakers, as keeping a place and family together. They left it drift. They abandoned themselves to drift. They were too far from recovering according to American social standards for home life. And they couldn't seem to return to any order or certainty. And often in A.G.'s descriptions, the Gudgers themselves were like ghosts in the house, immaterial, adrift, like the floating furniture. You almost see through them, even though they become very real and vivid people. And A.G. argues that eventually they became anesthetized, numb to their torment. Although before this, they tried briefly to locate or place or identify their sense of home according to some cultural standard. When you set up housekeeping, how do you measure or test yourself? And ultimately, they surrendered to nothingness with this floating furniture, with floating people in this bare and open place. A.G. said, they lived in a steady shame and insult of discomforts, insecurities, and inferiorities, piecing these together into whatever semblance of comfortable living they can. And the whole of it is a stark nakedness of makeshifts and the lack of means. Yet they are also, of course, profoundly anesthetized. The only direct opinion I got on the houses as such was from Mrs. Gudger, and it was, with the tears into her eyes, "Oh, I do hate this house so bad. Seems like there isn't anything in the whole world I can do to make it pretty." But it would have been far more comfortable to both A.G. and Mrs. Gudger if she had been. What do we make of this statement by A.G., however? He says, "It is my belief that such houses as these approximate, or at times by chance achieve, an extraordinary beauty. Are things beautiful which are not intended as such, but which are created on convergence of chance, need, innocence, or ignorance, and for entirely irrelevant purposes. The Gudger's front bedroom is, importantly, among other things, a great tragic poem." And this is A.G.'s dilemma. How does an obvious outsider become an insider in order to see the people in their places properly? And the book Let Us Now Praise Famous Men becomes a kind of training manual for building awareness, such as Dillard had, such as Black had, in an extreme and even ineffable way. An awareness of the geography of home, including one's own place, because A.G. found this was a search into his own interior life as well as that of the Gudgers. Now, by the 1970s, this quest for personal space even became an entire field of academic study. It's called cognitive mapping. It's done by geographers and psychologists. And there's even a field of psychological therapy called Gestalt psychology, which looks into this. And A.G.'s answer to his dilemma, to his questions, back in the 1930s, has even become an academic field by the 1960s, a specialty of cultural anthropology called religious mythification. A.G., in trying to figure himself out, as well as figure out the people in this place, because he found he had to do it, was not enough to report back to Fortune magazine, A.G. transformed the Gudger place from a hopeless pinprick on the earth into a place which possessed and contained spiritual power. And of course the question is this kind of an outrageous, rampant statement by an outsider? And this place, as he tried to transform it, is a place through which he sought to pass all humanity into a kind of timeless realm. We enter the book, we enter their lives, we enter their place, and we shoot straight up from there. He couldn't change how the Gudgers lived, but he sought to show how all of us passed through life as Gudgers. They were not only famous men, they were every man, with a capital E, every man. Only they experienced the human tragedy more directly and more constantly than most of us who try for a time to escape our vulnerability. A.G. even attempts to change the dimensions of the Gudger experience by shifting it from everyday life into the realm of the supernatural. In large part, his book is directly shaped along the line of Catholic or Episcopal Mass church service. A.G. himself was once an Episcopalian altar boy, but he soon lost his conventional faith. In the book, there are sections called introit and recessional, another part called testament, another part called sacrament. There's even a part of the house described as a shrine or altar and tabernacle. The altar stands, in A.G.'s thinking, at the wall opposite the Gudger bed in their bedroom. The other three walls are plain pine weatherboard, but the altar wall is of higher quality pine laid horizontally instead of vertically or angled. It is the only ornamented wall in the house. It has a mantle over the fireplace, which he says is painted an old and thin blue-white. There is even an altar table, he says, painted with blue auto paint. Nice and shiny, I guess. It's covered by a white cloth. And in the center of this blue auto paint table is a green glass bowl in which sits a white china swan. The swan's pointed north. Pinned along the edge of the mantle is the folded and scissored white pattern paper Mrs. Gudger's last attempt at domestic prettiness. On the wall, like icons, are a photograph of Mrs. Gudger's sister, 2 old calendars, and very unexpectedly, Catholic bleeding heart pictures of Jesus and Mary. A.G. notes that if the Gudgers knew that these were Catholic related, they would tear them down very quickly because this was a very anti-Catholic part of Alabama. But they were there, bleeding heart pictures of Jesus and Mary. And there was an illustrated page from a child's book. The altar table had a drawer which A.G. likens to a tabernacle. A tabernacle on an altar contains the supernatural, it said, in earthly form. And inside this particular drawer tabernacle are miscellaneous relics, baby dresses, a flattened doll, a tired old hat, and photographs from old newspapers. And A.G. writes of the totality of this room and the Gudgers' lives. What is taking place here is he's trying to explain this to himself, and it happens daily in the silence. What is taking place here, and it happens daily in the silence, is intimately transacted between this home and eternal space. It becomes that PowerPoint where all reality pours through. And on the Gudger place, the conjunction of heaven and earth do seem to happen. There's even a visionary moment late one morning, a dark and shuttered room where A.G. is sitting. A kind of luminous signal is sent through a knothole near the sharp crest of the roof. He calls it a long, bright rod of light. And it lights up a small vase of milky glass on the mantel, and it touches nothing else in the room at any point. Most important is, of all in the book, in this kind of religious context, is a sacramental meal A.G. receives from Mrs. Gudger. One night, late, near the end of his visit, he's leaving the house. And James A.G. gets his car stuck axle deep in some good Alabama mud on the road out. And he had to return to the house shamefacedly for help, almost perhaps like a prodigal son. And George Gudger tells him to stay the night and says, better eat some supper. And then this takes place. I was in fact very hungry, but I did all I was able to stop this, finally trying to compromise it to a piece of bread and some milk that needn't be pared. I'm making you enough bother already, but no. You can't go to bed without no supper. You just hold on a second or two. And he leans his head through the bedroom door and speaks to his wife, explaining, and lights the lamp. And we see these interactions on the part of people and powerful events take place. After a few moments, during which I hear her breathing and a weary shuffling of her heels, she comes up barefooted carrying the lamp, frankly and profoundly sleepy as a child. Feeling disgusted to wake her further with so many words, I say, hello, Mrs. Gudger. Hey, I want to tell you I'm awfully sorry to give you all this bother. You're just honest. I don't need much of anything. If you tell me where a piece of bread is, it'll be plenty. I'd hate for you to bother to cook up anything for me. But she answers me while passing, looking at me, trying to get me into focus from between her sticky eyelashes. That ain't no bother at all, and for me not to worry about that, and goes on into the kitchen. And how quickly I don't understand, for I'm too occupied to see with pleasure and withholding myself from the cardinal error of hovering around her or of offering to help her, that she has built a pine fire and set in front of me on the table in the hall, warmed over biscuit and butter and blackberry jam and a jelly glass full of buttermilk, and warmed field peas, fried pork, and 4 fried eggs. And she sits a little away from the table out of courtesy, trying to hold her head up and her eyes open, until I shall have finished eating, saying at one time how it's an awful poor sort of supper, and at another how it's awful plain meat food. I tell her different, and eat as rapidly as possible and a good deal more than I can hold, in fact all the eggs, a second large plate full of peas, most of the biscuit, feeling it is better to keep them awake and to eat too much than at the least to let them continue to believe I am what they assume I must be, superior to them or to their food, eating only so much as I need to be polite. And I see that they are in fact quite quietly surprised and gratified in my appetite. The biscuits are large and shapeless, not cut round, and are pale, not tanned, and are dusty with flour. They taste of flour and soda and damp salt and fill the mouth stickily. They are better with butter, and still better with butter and jam. The butter is pallid, soft, and unsalted, about the texture of cold cream. It seems to taste delicately of wood and wet cloth, and it tastes weak. The jam is loose, of little berries, full of light raspings of the tongue. It tastes a deep, sweet purple, tepidly watered, with a very faint sheen of a sourness as of iron. And you see, he's having a love affair with this meal. Field peas are olive brown, the shape of lentils, about twice the size. Their taste is a cross between lentils and boiled beans. Their broth is bright with seasoning of pork, and of this also they taste. The broth is soaked up in bread. The meat is a bacon, granular with salt, soaked in the grease of its frying. There is very little lean meat in it. What there is nearly as tough as rind. The rest is pure salted, stringy fat. The eggs taste of too. They are fried in it on both sides until none of the broken yolk runs, are heavily salted and peppered while they fry, so that they come to the table nearly black, very heavy, rinded with crispness, nearly as dense as steaks. Of milk I hardly know how to say. It is skimmed, blue-lighted. To a city palate, its warmth and odor are somewhat dirty, and at the same time vital, a little as if one were drinking blood. Think of the sacramental side of this again. There is even in so clean a household as this an odor of pork, of sweat, so subtle it seems to get into the very metal of the cooking pans beyond any removal of scrubbing and to sweat itself out of newly washed cups. It is all over the house and all through your skin and clothing at all times. Yet as you bring each piece of food to your mouth, it is so much more noticeable, if you are not used to it, that a quiet little fight takes place on your palate and in the pit of your stomach. And it seems to be this odor and a sort of wateriness and discouraging tepidity which combine to make the food seem unclean, sticky, and sallow with some invisible sort of disease. Yet this is the odor and consistency and temper, and these are true tastes of home. I know this even of myself, and much of it, as my reflexes are twitching in refusal of each mouthful, a true homesick, simple fondness for it has so strong hold of me that, in fact, there is no fight to speak of, and no faking of enjoyment at all. It's been said of the people of Appalachia often enough, as it was said of the Gudgers, that they lived entirely separate from town, school, church, and even separate from where blacks are, as isolated, excuse me, as if they settled on some distant American frontier. What A.G. saw through the outside glass darkly was a small company of people, a family, forced down to basic existence and who tried to establish both material and spiritual subsistence. Were they failures? Yes, by any standards of modern society. But A.G. was convinced they survived by other standards which cannot ordinarily be measured. Every man became famous men. But in this case, despite A.G.'s attempt to find grandeur in the Gudgers, he's not convincing. Their lives were desperate failures, and failures in the way we all fear, that is, to be trivialized and not even be allowed to participate in human tragedy. And this is perhaps the historic Appalachian dilemma, recognized by many writers, but really best of all by Roger Cunningham in his 1987 book, Apples on the Flood, and Roger's in the audience. Can there be a quest for self in a life so extremely devalued by society, rejected when measured by outside standards or expectations? The Gudgers failed because they became anesthetized. Who could blame them? Appalachians are praised for their radical separateness from the pressures of the outside world, but who is numbed and humiliated, Appalachia or the outside world under its own anesthetic of mass culture? James Agee and Walker Evans finally left the Three Dirt Farm families after their unexpectedly long stay. They stopped a day or two in Birmingham. They were surprised by the sense of relief they felt. as if they had escaped something which was not too thin, but too overwhelming. It was too much for them. They were back at their own familiar landscape in space, closer to New York 1,000 miles away than to the Gudgers 30 miles away. And he says, we might have the infinite relief of talking more nearly in our own language to others, to those who were enemies of our enemies, and that we might at the same time use rooms and beds and bathrooms and eat foods and walk through lobbies. We might stroll by the hour without the pressure upon us, the following, the swerving of the slow, blue, dangerous, and secret small-town eyes. We ate bloody foods in chilled rooms and drank liquors. We ate up the streets, their facades, their show windows, the traffic and people, their lights at night, their odors of soft coal and oil exhausts, the faces and forms of their women, as men starved or dried to husks in a desert might eat and drink. They were outside of Appalachia and home again out of the wilderness, and the Gudgers disappear from our view, back into their desert from which A.G. and Evan had returned. Thank you very much.
The title of my paper today is Sense Place in James Still's novel, River of Earth. And when I was originally asked to give this, I was told that Mr. Still would be here and would do a critique on my critique. And I was looking forward to that. I'm sure it may have been somewhat acerbic and disagreed with some of the points I'll make here, but I admire his work so much that I would take almost any amount of criticism just hear him. Place is one of the lesser angels that watch over the racing hand of fiction, wrote Eudora Welty at the beginning of her essay, Place in Fiction. She goes on to remark that place must be second to feeling, which in her mind wears the crown in fiction. But if place is one of the lesser angels, it is nonetheless an angel, and we should pay proper attention to its angelic habitude. I will argue in this particular paper that place is indeed an important fundament in Mr. Still's River of Earth, and that his skill in evoking his unique mountain place gives enviable cachet to his novel. I hope to show that it does more than this, that it is in fact the catalytic agent for the best effects in that novel. I wonder how many of you have read River of Earth. Can you? Well, over half of you have, so you're familiar with it then. Mr. Still joins a number of great American writers in emphasizing place in his fiction. American writers throughout the 19th and 20th century have lavished much of their talent on a loving evocation of place in their work. Walden Pond's bean fields and pickerel linger in our minds as long as Thoreau's aphorisms. William Faulkner lost his touch whenever he moved his fiction out of the tiny postage stamp of soil which cradled his Yoknapatawpha County. Mark Twain's picture of the Mississippi River, as seen through the eyes of the young Huck-Finn, has an immortality equal to any achieved by other American novelists. Tom Wolfe's Altamont has a vigor and a veracity that makes it come alive for each new generation of young readers. Sherwood Anderson continues to fade a bit for the present generation, but his Winesburg has influenced Hemingway, Wolfe, and Sinclair Lewis in their own fiction. Now, since the concept of place is so important to this paper, I would like to linger for a moment on what I imply by it in the following discussion. May I continue here Eudora Welty's remarks on place, and I condense and paraphrase them as follows. Place, she says, provides the basic reference for the experience out of which the author writes. All the arts celebrate the mystery of place. Its mystery lies in its having a more lasting identity we have. The magic lies partly in the name of the place, since that's what we gave it. The moment, the place in which the novel happens, accepted as true. The moment, the place in which the novel happens is accepted as true, through it will begin to glow in a kind of recognizable glory the feeling and the thought that inhabited the novel in the author's head and animated the whole of his work. That's for her a very important point, and she says about her own work, now I think many of you know her work, that she cannot really write a short story or a novel until in her own consciousness and pre-consciousness that incandescence, that kind of neon light goes on, which means that she feels that place integrally and knows it. And so she emphasizes that with great vigor. Feelings are bound in place and in art from time to time. Place undoubtedly works upon genius. How else can we explain a Wuthering Heights out of Yorkshire, or a Sound and the Fury out of Mississippi, or a River of Earth out of Kentucky? Place in fiction is the named, identified, concrete, exact and exacting, and therefore credible. And that's a lot of adjectives there, but she means all of those. And again, I'm quoting her because I think that place is of ultimate importance in the River of Earth, and she, in effect, verifies that. Therefore, credible gathering spot of all that has been felt is about to be experienced in the novel's progress. Location pertains to feeling. Feeling profoundly pertains to place. Every story would be another story and unrecognizable as art if it took up its character and plot and happened someplace else. And to give examples, imagine, for instance, Swan's Way, Marcel Proust's great novel, laid in London, or The Magic Mountain of Thomas Mann in Spain, or Green Mansions in Appalachia. All feelings, recognition, memory, history, valor, love, all the instincts of poetry and praise, worship and endeavor are bound up in poetry and praise. But what can place not give? It cannot give theme. Place can only suggest, but it must suggest what that theme is. Human life is fiction's only theme, and it is made fiction in order that it be communicated between writer and reader. Miss Welty concludes by saying that art speaks most clearly and passionately from a place of origin. And I think that's true of River of Earth. Speaks most clearly and passionately from its place of origin, and will remain the longest understood. And James Still does this in his own fiction in that particular novel. Through place, we put down our roots wherever and whenever birth, chance, or our traveling selves may set us down. But these roots reach toward is the deep and running vein of the human understanding. It is only the vision, she says, that can be new, but this vision is enough. Now, Miss Welty's comments on place carry considerable authority because she herself has been most adept at its use in such stories as A Worn Path, The Petrified Man, and in the novel, The Ponder Heart. With your permission, I would like to add a brief comment by Jacques Maritain, who was not a formal creative artist, but was skilled in metaphysics and aesthetics. I wish to present his statement because later in this paper I will argue that Still's River of Earth is in many ways a poetic production, and that place itself is presented therein under the rubric of poetry. In his well-known work, creative intuition in art and poetry, Maritain makes certain statements that I would like to draw on very briefly, and then we'll be through with this somewhat tortuous introduction here. These statements follow. First, art and poetry cannot do without one another, yet they are not synonymous, art and poetry. By art, I'm quoting him now, by art I mean the creative or producing work-making activity of the human mind. By poetry I mean not writing verses, but a process more general and more primary, namely that intercommunication between the inner being of things and the inner being of the human self, which is a kind of divination, D-I-V-I-N-A-T-I-O-N, a kind of divination. This was recognized in ancient times, he points out. The Romans called their poets vates, V-A-T-E-S, which in a sense was both a poet and a diviner, one who sees deep into hidden things, below the levels of reason. Now, poetry in this sense, says Maritain, in this sense of being that intercommunication between the hidden life of things and the deep human self. Poetry in this sense is the secret life of each and all of the arts. And I believe that the intercommunication referred to here is found most strikingly in Still's novel, The River of Earth. And now to speak more explicitly of place in the River of Earth. The story opens in March on the creek called Little Carr, a creek in the eastern Kentucky mountains early in the 20th century. We see a small house holding to a scrap of land and a black birch, the only tree on all the barren slope above the town of Blackjack, or the village of Blackjack. We meet Brack Baldridge, coal miner, and his wife, Alpha. Inside their house move three children, Yulie, the oldest, at 12, James, who is 7, and obviously is the alter ego of James Still. James is the voice, the center of consciousness of this novel. And he's Jimmy, of course, as James Still was Jimmy Still, who is 7 and also our first person narrator and center of consciousness, and Fletch, 5 years old. Alpha, the mother, carries a fourth child, a baby on her hip as she works over the rusty stove in the shed room. Outside it is March, and there are robins by the house because they never left for the winter. And sapsuckers have come early to drill the black birch beside the house. The yeast of nature drops so early into our text will work its way all the way through the book. In a sense, nature both frames and interpenetrates almost all the scenes in the book. The last chapter, skip from the opening to the last chapter opens on a windy March evening 3 years later. The Baldridges are in another mining camp in another company house, this one with 2 real glass windows in every room. Since the opening scene of the novel, the baby has died in the winter and has been buried with a funeralizing in the summer. Grandmother has died and now rests in a coffin in this final scene of the novel, a coffin supported by 2 chairs in the front room of her daughter's house. Alpha, Brack's wife, is again with child and about to give birth. Jimmy, now 10 or 11, sits up for the night with his dead grandmother. Late in the night, as sleep dropped down upon him, he speaks. "Grandma, where have you gone?" Morning comes and he wakes, trembling with cold. The coffin box has been taken away. He runs outside, and there are only wagon tracks to mark where Dad had come into his house and gone again. He turns suddenly toward the house and listens. And the text says, quote, "A baby was crying in the far room." And with that sentence, the novel ends. Such is one way of describing place in River of Earth. In the intervals between these two scenes, we follow the Baldridge family in a seemingly endless odyssey of moves from one mining camp to another, with an occasional pause on a small patch of ground in some remote mountain area to gratify Alpha's love of the rural life. And this odyssey throws into relief for the reader a fundamental conflict in temperaments between husband and wife, between Brack and Alpha. Alpha is passionately an agrarian. She loves the earth, its vegetables and flowers. She is a very private person and cherishes the solitude of the farm where she is enclosed with the people she loves, her husband and her children. But Brack is a pragmatist. He likes coal mining, which brings him the big money, dully welcome in a cash-poor economy. He has no sentimental attachment to home or farm and seems to take easily to the nomadic life of the coal miner of that period. He thinks Alpha is a sentimentalist, although he loves her and would like to humor her as much as he can. In effect, this conflict, a major one in the novel, grows naturally out of the place inhabited by the Baldridge family. We can now focus on Still's depiction of that place in somewhat greater detail. Still, adherent to one of the most ancient axioms in the writing trade, has written about what he knows. Though he grew up in the Appalachian foothills of northern Alabama, he moved in 1932 to an eastern Kentucky farm between Wolfpen Creek and Dead Mare Branch in Knott County, where, to the best of my knowledge, he continues to live and write in an ancient log cabin today. It's a matter of interest to me that Still's at Vanderbilt University around 1930, taking a master's degree, and that he was thus cognizant of the work and the ideas of the so-called fugitives and the agrarians, the famous intellectual groups at that time. One of the more famous of this group was Allen Tate, poet, critic, and novelist. Tate, in one of the best-known artisans of the movement, wrote that, quote, "Only by a return to the provinces, to the small self-contained centers of life, can we ever put the all-destroying abstraction of America to rest." Now, James Still, like William Faulkner, has studiously avoided involvement with any organized writer group. In spite of this, I feel that the sense of his work is to return to small, self-contained centers of life, and indeed to put the abstraction of America to rest, as indeed he does in his novel, The River of Earth. It is a marvelous that he does when he transposes the mountain world of eastern Kentucky into the crisp, pellucid, fictional world of River of Earth. He describes the physical contours of this world with a sharp reality. It is a kind of realism, but as we read the following passage, we feel something else moving in consciousness of our young boy narrator. This is a quote from his novel. "January was a bell in Lean Neck Valley. The ring of an axe was a mile wide, and all passage over the spewed-up earth was lifted on frosty air and sounded against fields of ice." And in the following passage, as 9-year-old Jimmy plows for the first time, plows the ground for the first time, quote, "Then Uncle Jolly stood aside and let me hold the handles. The mule looked back, he kept going. The share rustled like drifted leaves. It spoke through the handles. I felt the earth flowing steady as time." That last line, "I felt the earth flowing as steady as time," is a marvelous line and has a deep poetic lilt which is carried throughout the novel as a great river of poetry itself. In fact, one is deeply reminded of the poetic realism of Elizabeth Madden Roberts in her very great novel, The Time of Man. The matrix of the poetic realism in both and Roberts seems to be their mysterious attraction to nature, their deep compulsion to celebrate over and over the powers and rituals of nature. I hope some of you have read The Time of Man and are aware of that particular comparison. They are both very great writers. Each writer gives us time signals, that is both Roberts and Still gives us time signals, seasonal signals on almost every page as the great wheel of the year rolls forward. The cumulative effect of reading River of Earth is to be convinced that James Still is indeed a poet in the maritime sense, namely in that intercommunication between the inner being of things and the inner being of the human self, which is a kind of divination. Indeed, he is a diviner. He is a vates. He is a seer. Consider the grace of the following description as winter is dying into spring in the mountains, and the boy Jimmy longs to leave Granny's cabin and to go home. He's been there for almost a year now. This is a quotation. Before a tip of green showed in any brushy place, you could feel spring growing through the sky. You could feel spring growing through the sky. The robins came early, cocking heads in cold. The gray bodies of goldfinches yellowed for all the world like pussy buds blooming. And where no sign held on wood or field, finger twigs of elder and willow and service swell beneath their hulled bark. So much of the richness and evocativeness of place in the River of Earth depends on Still's poetic sense. And that's one of the great pleasures in reading his novel, is to resonate to that poetic sense. One thinks, in fact, of Dylan Thomas's great poem, Fern Hill, and the great mystical evocations of nature in modern literature. One thinks of Gerard Manley Hopkins' The Wind Hover, equally great in his own way. The wind hover being, of course, a kind of a hawk, kestrel, and a kind of beauty which is tied back to God in the figures of speech by Hopkins, who was a Jesuit. So it does have a kind of pageant quality. Reality and action seem to slow down in a stylized, contemplative manner as Jimmy, our center of consciousness, broods in the manner of Walt Whitman by the great ongoing stream of mountain life. Thus Still creates a world, a place whose resources resound and echo beyond the last word to the fullness of the reader's capacity to understand. Now this is all made possible by the tonally perfect style of Jimmy, our narrator, which is clear, which is dry, which is unsentimental, and also seemingly completely non-judgmental. Jimmy is not a judger. He records life, its richness and all of its tragedies. He does not judge any of us. But time runs out, and I need to foreshorten the rest of my argument. Let me put it this way. Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, defined reality as a flux of mutually interpenetrated parts unseizable by the intellect. Reality is a flux of mutually interpenetrated parts unseizable by the intellect. Now, my idea of place is somewhat like that analogously. My idea of place is that place is a unity, that is place in fiction. A place in fiction is a unity of mutually interpenetrated fictional modes whose unity can only be intuitively grasped. You don't get it analytically, logically, it's only by intuition. Now this is especially true of the novel The River of Earth. What we call conflict, symbol, tone, style, etc., are all intimately related to place and mutually interpenetrated. They're like a great mosaic. Since it would take too much time to comment on these factors in detail, let me at least name them before I draw a conclusion. Consider each of these modes as being in an intuitive way related to place. First, there are themes. Number one, life is hard for the Baldridges. That's an overriding theme there. At times, hunger becomes their familiar. There are many times in which they have only just a scrap of bacon rind and a little flour in the house. They know to live out life in hunger and cold and not complain about it. Second, what we might call the family rumble. Husband and wife are on the farm and mine. God believes kinfolks conquer all. If he has anything, kinfolks get it too. Ma believes that your children come first, and they come before your relatives. And they never resolve that, by the way. That goes, as you know, all the way through the novel. Third, the Ulyssean motif, the motif of wandering. The family here is ever on the move. They never settle down. Ma wants to settle down. Pa wants to go for the big money, and they are always on the move, like Ulysses, always searching for his way home. Fourth, the river of earth, which gives the title to the novel. This theme is stated in Brother Sim Mobley's sermon, and let me read just a couple of sentences from that sermon. Brother Sim is a great, talented, untutored preacher, much beloved by Mrs. Baldridge. And in his sermon, he opens the Bible, picks a text, and then closes it and begins, "My eyes were sought upon the hills from the beginning." The hills are the great mountains. "I used to think a mountain was the standingest object in the sight of God. It says here, they go skipping and hopping like sheep, a rising and a falling. These hills are just dirt waves washing through eternity. Oh, my children, where are we going on this mighty river of earth, a borning, begetting, and a dying, the living and the dead, riding the waters, where it's sweeping us?" In Brother Mobley's vision, the earth takes on the character of Heraclitean flux. All things flow. You never step in the same river twice because it's a different river. There is a hidden irony in Brother Sim's vision, because in the lifetime of our character Jimmy, he was to see the mountain earth pulverized by surface mining and deluged by cloudbursts, literally become a river of earth and flow away. In West Virginia in 1985, they had what you might call a 1,000-year flood at Cheat River, and farm after farm had all the topsoil stripped from it. It was a river of earth flowing down. It literally became true there, and that's sort of an irony in Brother Sim Mobley's sermon. Next, the mystique of nature, the mystique of nature. In his own way, still is as sensitive to the nuances of nature as was Thoreau, John Muir, or Walt Whitman. Nature is the most central piece in Still's mosaic of place, and it's the most beautiful by far. Now there is humor, a light, dry humor, nothing heavy-handed. Two samples. When the novel opens, times are hard for the Baldridges. Pa's been laid off at the mines, and the only food in the house is cornmeal and beans. It is December, and this mite of food won't last till spring, and garden. They have no money, no credit. To make matters worse, 3 freeloaders have lodged themselves, family, in this little hut. The 2 big eaters, Harl and Tip, who are cousins of Pa, have come in, and Uncle Samp, who eats regularly but never dirties his hands with work. So they're always at table, but Uncle Samp never works. Now, Mother is carrying a baby and can't get enough food to sustain it. Her anger boils over. She speaks to Father. "We have enough bran for 3 more pans of bread. It won't last us more than 3 meals. Your kin will have to go today and she's very emphatic on that. Father put his spoon down with a clatter. My folks eat when we eat, he said, and as long as we eat. And there's the family rumble right there. The next day was clear, and the man folks traced off to Blackjack. Ma marshals the children, moves the furniture and stove into the large smokehouse, then puts a torch to her house. When the neighbors in the valley below arrive, the walls have fallen in, and Ma stands among the scattered furnishings, face calm and triumphant. When the freeloaders return, there's no place to roost. The revolt of Mother is complete there, and it's told with a delightful touch. One other example, quickly. Jimmy's Uncle Jolly is a free spirit who's landed in the state penitentiary. He also takes care of Granny. He's the brother of Jimmy's mother. Granny learns that Jolly is coming home early with a pardon from the state penitentiary. She cooks up a very fine meal and receives him with great hoorahs and congratulations. Jolly eats gigantically and tells him about the fire in the penitentiary, which fought and put out when everyone else, he said, ran off like a chicken with his head wrung off. Then the governor heard how I fed the fire and never run, and he gave me a pardon. Granny spoke up. Whoever lit that fire ought to be whipped with an ox hide. Who lit that fire, son? Uncle Jolly dropped his eyes and swallowed and said, I sot it, Mommy. The humor is much in the tradition of the old Southwest humor found with someone like Sut Lovingood. But what can we say in conclusion about this extraordinary novel? In the child narrator, Jimmy, and in Jimmy's parents and siblings, and in the mountain folk who cluster about them, inured to hunger, hardship, and poverty, still celebrates convincingly the courage which enables the human race to push outward against the great overlying barrier, the enveloping dark. It is a novel both indigenous and universal. The insights into life and character are original and profound. His control of his laconic and undercut style is masterful, a rare example of the successful welding of realism and poetry. I don't have time to deal with his idiom, figures of speech, but those of you who have not read the novel will find that they are very extraordinary, nothing cliche in any page of the work. And they contribute, of course, massively to the eminence of the work. The individual scenes of the novel have the ageless quality of folk song and the sharp impact of life and unflinchingly observed. The lyric runs of language are virtually flawless. What Elizabeth Maddox Roberts, in a great novel, The Time of Man, did for wandering tenant farmer and tobacco sharecropper of the Kentucky Bluegrass region, James Still has done for the coal miner family, equally nomadic in the eastern Kentucky mountains. Although each novel is unique, there are distinct parallels between the two. It is fitting that they should keep each other company, that is, Roberts and Still. They are among the graceful best of Kentucky's fiction and of American fiction. Now, the reader coming to this novel today, 1987, brings with him the vast detritus of books, articles, TV shows, discussions concerning the rape of Appalachia. All of this is here. All of this is here in The River of Earth, published around 1940. But more or less by implication, that is, he doesn't make it a propaganda work, doesn't labor the point at all. But when you read percipiently, you see he's saying the same thing. The effortless eye of the narrator occasionally picks us up as when he records, quote, "The rivers ran yellow, draining acid from the mines, cankering rocks in its bed. There were no fishes swimming in the eddies, nor striders looking at themselves in the water glass," end of the quote. But Still does not lecture us. Never does he do that. His voice is never strident. The caustic land lay in the preternaturally clear mind of the child. He can see the death of the land and the streams as he can see the death of Granny Middleton. But through it all, the great river Earth flows on. Quote, a baby was crying in the far room. And this last sentence of the novel is a note affirmation. It is like Molly Bloom's closing soliloquy in Joyce's Ulysses, which ends the last words of the novel, yes, 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 says Molly. James Still also affirms life in the birth. Baby is his yes, yes, yes to life. Thank you very much.
My agenda this morning is to talk about the idea of place in the Appalachian region. I find it interesting that those of us who have been concerned with issues Appalachian over the last 20, 25 years have always talked about this issue of place and our tie to this place, but we've never, I think, carefully examined what those things mean for us personally as individuals, or what they mean for us in the future either. I know most of my life I have felt this strong sense of tie to mountain communities. My family was one of those 3 million that left the region for a period of time in the 50s. We moved for a few years up to Ohio to work in auto and the rubber factories, and that went back home every other weekend. And Ohio was never home. We always went back home. And I guess it was in that process, all of those years of traveling all night long on Saturday evening to get back in before church on Sunday morning, that I acquired this strange attachment. And I think it's interesting that the whole conference today is related to that. I don't want to tell a lot of jokes, but there is one that I admire, and I'll share as a way of getting into this morning. It's one of Loyal Jones's stories. I don't know whether Loyal is here yet or not, but Loyal tells the story about the fellow who died and went to heaven. And St. Peter was showing him around heaven and showed him the pearly gates and the golden streets, and they listened to the heavenly choir and the angels playing the harps, and it was all just tremendous. And as they were walking back to the pearly gates, the new arrival heard this moaning and groaning and this terrible sound, and walked down a piece and noticed it was coming from a group of people who were all congregated together, but they were all chained up. And the fellow turned to St. Peter and said, well, who are those? And St. Peter said, oh, those are just hillbillies. And he said, well, why are they chained up? If we didn't do that, they'd be going back home all the time. In many ways, the idea of place has long been an ambiguous metaphor when applied to the Appalachian region. It's long been used to explain the attachment of a particular group of people to a particular region. I think it has had two aspects. By some, this idea of place has been used to explain what many have found to be a provincialism and a backwardness, a lack of a progressive spirit in the region, a spirit for change. For many, the Appalachians' attachment to place has kept them out of the mainstream and has been a barrier to change. There are others, however, who have viewed the idea of a sense of place in a more positive sense and have argued that the Appalachian sense of place provides security, identity, sense of meaning and purpose to the lives of people who live in the region. Many of the latter tend to see the Appalachian sense of place in almost romantic terms, because many of the latter tend to be rooted urbanites themselves who are in the process of a search for meaning and want to find that sense of place among Appalachians. I'd like to do three things this morning. First of all, I'd like to discuss the meaning of place in Appalachian culture, at least as best as I've been able to identify that meaning of place. Then secondly, I'd like to make some connections with some other things that I've been working on recently, and that is the relationship of identification with place to identification with community, and the relationship of place to community. And then third, providing we have time, I'd like to move that relationship a little further along and talk about aspects of rebuilding connections. I've written a couple of articles recently on the problems of rebuilding community in the mountains and the need for that. And I'd like to speak to that if I can. If we look at the whole idea of place, I think as an aspect, a concept in the Appalachian region, I would argue that the Appalachian concept of place implies not so much a physical locality, but a set of relationships. In that sense, I think it is similar to the sense of place in the South as a whole. And in fact, what I would argue today applies. Since I'm a Southern historian, I don't think that these concepts are unique to Appalachia at all. I think they permeate much of the rural South, at least. But the sense of place implies not so much a physical locality, as frequently I think urbanites and many folks from the North assume, but a sense of relationship, human relationships that define personal identity, establish a shared history, sense of the past,